and welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I wanted to do one that's a little bit more casual than some of my recent content. This one's basically going to be an additional little video to the PC culture video that I made last. And if you haven't seen that video, I talk about the evolution of language, orthodoxy within ideology, and the euphemism treadmill, and so on. And so in this video, I wanted to analyze a few specific instances of politically correct terminology that has been thrust upon all of us in the last decade or so, and kind of show how some of it is pointless and useless, some of it harms the movements that it's meant to advocate for. I'm going to talk about the hypocrisy in some of these terms, and I'm going to relate some of it to Orwellian language and Orwell's criticisms of where language is going. And then, of course, I'm going to discuss where I see language going in the future. But most of all, this video is kind of just going to be a rant about language that gets under my nerves, because I can be petty sometimes. And so I guess to begin, I'll start with some recent terminology within the transgender movement that I think does more harm for the cause than good. The one I'm mainly going to fixate on is the assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth terminology, which according to the GLAAD website, you're supposed to use now instead of biological male or biological female. And this specific change of language bothers me because, number one, it seems like biological sex is just something arbitrarily picked by the doctor when you're born, like he just assigns you male or female on a whim. It literally has no basis in reality. The only context in which I could see this being useful is in the case of intersex people or hermaphrodites, where the doctor sometimes kind of has to make a call of which sex this baby leans more towards. But the reason why I feel like this is damaging to the transgender movement is because it treats biological sex as if it's not a literal scientific fact. And there are actually some transgender advocates who want to get rid of the notion of biological sex altogether. I've gotten into legitimate arguments with people who think that biological sex doesn't exist, even though it is a literal fact. And as I mentioned in my PC culture video, if there wasn't a difference between the sexes, there would literally be no point in transitioning. Transgender wouldn't even exist. And when it comes to my personal views on the transgender movement, I fully support political equality for people regardless of sex or race or anything like that, which obviously includes transgender people. And I think with the exception of course, the detransitioners, who are people who think they're transgender and then after transitioning realize that they're not, which is extremely tragic. I think most people who choose to take hormones for the rest of their life that can literally make them sterile and spend tens of thousands of dollars on surgery and change their name and have to tell everyone in their lives that they're a woman now or a man now, I think most people wouldn't choose that. Like, I definitely believe transgender people or whatever. I can't imagine being so uncomfortable in my body and truly feeling like the opposite sex that route sounds easier than just repressing it. Yeah, so I have nothing against transgender people or the transgender movement, in case you're wondering. But the reason I don't like this term assigned female or male at birth is because it's politicizing the language. It's turning it into an ideology instead of scientific fact. And this is a huge turnoff for people who would otherwise either be moderate or maybe even support the transgender movement. Because if someone is on the fence about something or isn't really that invested, and then they see literal facts being changed for a certain agenda, which by the way is like propaganda, they are probably going to be pushed more towards the anti-trans train than they would otherwise, because people don't like it when people are trying to alter reality, like literal factual reality. It generally points to bigger issues, and obviously that's really going to make people upset. And as I said also in my PC culture video, it's really upsetting that you can't even talk about biological sex in certain circles without being deemed bigot or transphobic and so on, when it's literally an integral part of the whole transgender ideology and movement and so on. I'm going to link a video down below as well that Blair White made about why she feels like so much anti-trans rhetoric is out there and sentiment is out there, and she relates it to the gay rights issue and how gay rights was more about, we get that we're different, but we could still be contributive members of society and live happy and healthy lives, versus a lot of people in the very recent, very online transgender community want to completely change our whole structure and our notions of scientific fact and try and literally change reality to a way that everyone outside the movement can see is not real or factual, and this just turns a lot of people off. She talks about a lot of really important and interesting stuff in that video. I know she's a YouTuber that people either love or hate. Personally, I love her. I've been watching her for like 5 years, and it's a really thought-provoking and informative video, so I will leave that down below. And then some other recent transgender terminology. This is something that kind of baffled me when I saw on the GLAAD website. It says it's okay to say sex reassignment surgery, but you're not allowed to say sex change operation when those are literally synonymous. That's exactly what sex reassignment surgery means. Like, if you take each word in that phrase, it means exactly the words in the other phrase. So I don't understand how sex change operation is supposed to be offensive at all. And then also, apparently you're not supposed to say transgenders when you're referring to a group of transgender people, which also doesn't make any sense to me because everyone says gays and lesbians when you're talking about gays and lesbians. So why can't you say transgenders? And of course, this whole thing seems very arbitrary, but there are legitimately people who are trying to enforce these words on others and censor the other words. And obviously, I'm all about free speech. If you haven't seen my PC culture video, that's what I'm all about. And you can get upset at whatever words you want to. Obviously, this whole video is me getting upset by words. But some of the issue with this is that obviously certain countries have hate speech laws. And when words like this get put into hate speech laws, like sex change operation or whatever, language can get so diluted to where, yeah, literally a false reality can become the new normal. Assigned female at birth could be what people actually call regular biological women. And that can just lead to so much dilution of reality, and it's just a slippery slope and not a good idea in my opinion. And so my next section, which is kind of related, is on alternate spellings of the word woman, replacing the A with an X or a Y or whatever else you want to replace it with. And the reason why some people do this, namely feminists, is because they feel like the fact that the word man is in the word woman, that's offensive, even though replacing the A with some weird consonant literally just adds more attention to the fact that the word man is in the word woman, and also the fact that the word man being inside of another word literally doesn't matter. And these kind of people also get offended by using man as a catch-all term for humankind, you know, mankind, instead of saying humankind, or I guess Womxn kind, if that's what they want. Which is also really annoying because the word man literally doesn't even have a gendered origin. It emerged as a gender-neutral term to refer to people and humans in general. That's why we use mankind to refer to people. And you might think there's absolutely no one today who still puts a consonant in the word woman, but there actually are. And there actually are people who get offended by using the word man in a general term to encompass all genders. I was literally reading a blog one time where the person did a little book review on Man's Search for Meaning, the book by Viktor Frankl, and I literally saw a comment that said, "The way you describe the book sounds interesting, but the fact that he used the word man in the title instead of something more inclusive turns me off and I'm not going to read it." This is a 1946 book from a Nazi concentration camp survivor writing about his experience, and this person in 2021 won't read it because it has the word man in the title. I can't tell you how upset I was by this. I know it's so petty, but I was literally fuming. I'm still fuming about it now. And I've also seen online a lot the word folks, but the S is an X, as if folks is even a gendered term, as if the consonant S has any gender associated with it. It makes absolutely no sense, and it's really infuriating for me. I don't know what the point of all this is, if it's trying to be inclusive of more letters of the alphabet, since vowels are in every word and X, Y, and Z are not often used. But the whole thing honestly reminds me of MySpace, back when the emos on MySpace would put all those X's before and after their username, just like an aesthetic edginess. I'm guessing when it comes to the word folks, that's where it originates from, because there's no reason to replace the letter S with an X if you're trying to be gender neutral or whatever. But that's just a small gripe, but it does lead me into the next section, which is on the word Latinx or Latinx. And so if you haven't heard Latinx yet, it's supposed to be a gender neutral term for Latinos. And for this section, I'm actually going to read a message that one of my subscribers sent to me after he had watched my extended adolescence video, in which I talk about the sort of cancel culture politics on university campuses and how hostile it could be. And he talks about his opinion on the word Latinx and why he doesn't like it. And before I get into that, I guess I'll also say literally most Hispanics don't like it. Either this year or last, there was a Pew Research poll which found that only 3% of Latinos use the word Latinx. And when it comes to Latinos who are aware of the term, a vast majority still prefer other terms like Hispanic or Latino. But this subscriber states, "I was in a GE cluster when I went to UCLA. It was history of modern thought. We were discussing Locke, and for whatever reason, gender norms came up. Not only that, but everyone kept referring to me as Latinx. I was only slightly annoyed, mainly because it was an 8 a.m. discussion, and honestly, I don't care enough to be called something that I don't identify as. It was only when a tally of people was made, and the student teacher wanted to ask the Hispanic students if we were all okay with Latinx. I was the only one who didn't raise my hand and was consequently called a bigot. Oh, it's because you're white passing and a male." By this point, I still haven't said a single word, but accusations were already thrown at me. I asked if I could speak since it was still a class setting, and unprompted arguments have no place in a class setting. I just asked if anyone would care to ask me why I didn't agree with the term Latinx. I'll keep my thoughts brief for the sake of brevity. Latinx doesn't sound Hispano-hablante to me. By the way, I'm going to pronounce some words wrong, sorry. It sounds incredibly made up, if I can even say that, and really out of place in Spanish. X has a different mechanism in Spanish, so it just sounds like Spanglish. There are many examples of Spanglish, all of which I dislike because it isn't the case of one language adopting another if it can't be conjugated. I prefer the elegance of languages that have defined rules and work. Why not use another gender-neutral pronoun, one that actually uses the mechanisms within Spanish, like Latine, that could replace Latino or Latina for those who feel constrained by gender norms. I explained how I thought it was silly to have ad hominem tossed against me for considering how the structure of Latinx poses a lot of problems within the Spanish language and that there are way better substitutes, and couldn't understand how others see that as an attack on gender neutrality itself. It was at this point that I actually tried to explain to the person who called me a bigot the usefulness of Latine by speaking to that person in Spanish. That person didn't know Spanish. Bad on me to assume, but I also laughed at the fact that I was called white passing when I literally have an accent, considering English was my third language and grew up speaking Spanish/Nahuatl, albeit my Nahuatl is very poor now, lost through time. Being punished and demonized for thinking critically. I wasn't even doing any sort of critical thinking, just thinking. And I just thought that was a really interesting message because that is kind of like my experience on college campuses, just the cult mentality where people will just go after you no matter what you're saying, even if you're just making common sense or asking a question. And that's of course how things are a lot in the regular world now with PC culture and social media and so on. But I've talked to a lot of other people as well who really dislike the word Latinx, who are or would be considered Latinx themselves. And I remember when I first saw this word on some bulletin board at my college, and I literally I had such a visceral, angry reaction because I was like, this is literally just something Americans made up to kind of impose themselves on another language. Like, no one outside the US would ever use the word Latinx. And I'm not trying to throw around this term lightly, but also the whole Latinx thing, you know, trying to control another language that isn't yours to kind of conform to your country's gender norms. It seems kind of racist. Not to mention, languages like Italian and Spanish are literally gendered like all throughout. You know, policia in Spanish refers to the police force. That's a feminine word, even though obviously most police officers are male, and no one gets offended over that. I mean, I don't understand what the goal of this is. Do you want to replace every O and every A in every Romance language with an X? Because that makes no sense. Like tacos, it's gonna be toxks now. Not every language is like English, okay? Like, some languages literally have gendered grammatical functions. It's not all like how it is in America and England and Canada and so on. But it seems like Latinx has been catching on. In my experience, I literally hear people use it in daily language unironically. And remember, you're allowed to say Latinx, you're allowed to say Philippinx, but you can't say... I'm sorry, that's such a bad joke. I saw in a YouTube comment, now everyone's gonna think I'm racist. But anyways, that's my gripe with Latinx. And that's it when it comes to specific words. Now I'm gonna get into language around political movements. And this sort of relates to the concept of newspeak because a lot of this language is meant to sound really nice and pleasant and kind of masks the ideological origins that it comes from. And my biggest gripe with these terms are just how kind of emotionally charged they are and how kind of vague they are to the actual causes that they represent. The main one I'm going to be talking about is Black Lives Matter. And the issue I take with the term Black Lives Matter being used to specify a very specific political group is because it's a general phrase that pretty much anyone, unless you're literally a racist, would agree with. Black Lives Matter, obviously, like, duh. But when it's referring to a very specific political ideology and entity, which Black Lives Matter is, then it makes it sound like any critique of that political movement makes it sound like you think Black lives don't matter. Like, it sounds like a critique of the more general definition of the term rather than the actual political entity it arises from. This is similar to the group Antifa, which stands for anti-fascism. If you critique them, it sounds like you're anti-fascism if you're anti-Antifa. And it's like, no, like, you could criticize Antifa and not be a fucking fascist. But when it comes to, you know, movements like Black Lives Matter and the fact that criticizing Black Lives Matter just sounds racist in and of itself because of the language used to describe that group is really upsetting in my opinion, especially when, like every political group and every political ideology, there is a lot that should be criticized. There are literally chapters of the Black Lives Matter movement that have not seen hardly any money, have had to create petitions and essays to try to get the Black Lives Matter higher-ups to be transparent with their finances because they hadn't been since their inception. And they were literally promising, for instance, to pay for the funerals of people who had lost their children to police violence and then just ghosted and dipped. And then, of course, you know, the co-founder, who is a self-described Marxist, literally bought 4 properties worth millions of dollars and no one knows how she got the money. And also, if you're a self-described Marxist, why are you owning 4 properties? Like, you realize that that's completely counterintuitive, right? Like, under socialism, people don't get to have 4 properties. Maybe try lining up your actions with your beliefs. And there are plenty of people, obviously, who have criticized Black Lives Matter. Their donations are filtered through a third party that literally donates money to Democratic candidates. That's the whole goal. Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, doesn't really do a lot for Black lives. But the reason I think it was so effective and why they literally got $90 million in donations last year is because of that phrasing. Because when people hear Black Lives Matter, they're like, well, of course. And everyone's against racism. I mean, not everyone, but you should be. And so people took to the streets because they were like, of course Black Lives Matter, and they're completely disconnected from the actual roots of the organization, and took it on more as a general statement of being against racism and police brutality rather than supporting this specific political group. And also by the terminology Black Lives Matter, I think people assumed that the money that they donated would be going to direct action to help Black people when that's not the case. And this just reminds me of newspeak because it's really euphemistic language that describes something it's actually not. It's very misleading in my opinion. In 1984, all the organizations in that book have very pleasant sounding names like Ministry of Truth, Ministry of Love, Ministry of Justice, when in reality the actual aims of that group are oftentimes very separate from what they claim to be. And I'm not saying Black Lives Matter as a whole is bad, but I am saying that I feel like the terminology that they use is misleading. And then like I said a couple minutes ago, same with Antifa, because if you criticize Antifa, it sounds like you're being pro-fascism, when really this term that has a general sentiment that everyone agrees with is being used to describe a very specific group who uses it for their own purposes. And so now for the final section, if you're still watching this video, this is where I personally see language going in the future. One thing that I think is going to happen is I feel like a lot more visual language is going to integrate itself into regular speak. I had a dream a few weeks ago that I was talking to someone and half of their language, half of the words they were using was split into hand movements, like TikTok hand gestures. It was like as if I knew the grammatical structure of the language, but the individual words were just like missing, like blanks, because the person was literally doing hand signals to say those words. And obviously American Sign Languages exist, like I'm not that stupid. But I do think a different sort of sign language is gonna come about, a TikTok sign language, which sounds crazy, but I just think as our platforms get more digital and language is conveyed through gestures more and more, I wouldn't be surprised if certain words either get invented via hand motion or certain words just transition into being hand motions based on visual platforms. And if you think that's crazy, let me know in the comments, it's fine. And then of course, as we've seen internet speak working its way into real life, IRL in real life, a lot of people use text lingo in their daily conversations. And then back in the 1940s, when George Orwell penned that famous essay, Politics and the English Language, where he talks about words and language getting more and more vague and less precise due to sort of political correctness. He views it as people kind of disguising what things really are with really vague, broad language. Number one, some people just do it to sound pretentious, but it also has political implications in his argument to where people use euphemistic language, you know, like neutralizing someone when you mean killing them. And I think there is going to be a continuance of this vague language and really long, elaborate sentences that really mean something that you could say in 3 words. Because PC culture does seem to be getting worse and people do seem to be more divisive, that people are very particular about what they say. Everyone's kind of walking on a minefield. And I feel like using very vague, especially very distancing language is going to be a real big thing. Because when you just say something directly in a culture that is just so prone to outrage over language, it's really a lot scarier than making up vague words where no one really knows what you're saying and you're kind of distanced from it and you don't really know what you're saying either and you're just like, oh, like, I don't know. I feel like that's just more common. And this is something that's very arbitrary, I think, but I have noticed Gen Z slang of saying big mad or big mad to describe how angry someone is, and just I don't think it's a big deal at all. But it is really funny because it does remind me of 1984 and newspeak, because in that book, language is really simplified down to where there is only one exemplifier, which is plus. And so like the 1984 version would be plus good or double plus good to mean very good or excellent, whereas big mad and big mad is like he's mad or he's very mad. And I don't think that's gonna eventually encompass all language. I don't think we're gonna just completely get rid of adjectives like that, though maybe we will. I think it's just one instance of slang, but I just kind of want to bring it up because why not? But anyway, that's my video. Sorry if this one was a little bit less structured, a little bit rambly. Like I said, Meant to be a casual video. I'm trying to add some shorter videos to my repertoire in between the very long, intensive ones, just because I like to post on YouTube and hear what you guys have to say, and because it helps me stay consistent, and sometimes there's just things I want to talk about that don't need to be in a 35-minute video. But let me know any thoughts that you have. Let me know which terms I missed. I'm sure you probably have terms that upset you. And for anyone who's saying, wow, Claire, you're such a hypocrite. You make fun of social justice warriors for getting triggered by words, and then you just put out like a 15-minute video of you being triggered by words. Yeah, number one, everyone's a little bit hypocritical sometimes, but number two, there's a difference between words getting under your skin and trying to censor language and censor what people can talk about. I would never try to censor someone's language. If you like any of these terms and use them, I'm not gonna stop you. I'm honestly not gonna care. I have better things to do with my time. But like all human beings, there are some things that get under my skin, and this is just a video about that. Anyways, if you like this kind of content, hit the subscribe button. If you think this video is lame, maybe watch some of my better videos, I don't know, or just leave, it's fine. If you like the video also, of course, give it a thumbs up, and I will see you guys next time.